All right, welcome everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about how to grow a marketing or PR agency, how to get more clients, how to get more referrals, overcome the hurdles that agencies experience, how to scale up, how to hire, all of those sorts of things. My guest is Chip Griffin. He's a world-renowned expert in agency growth who's been around the internet for 20 plus years. So we're going to have lots of interesting discussions. Stay tuned.
Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we feature top entrepreneurs, business leaders, and thought leaders and ask them how they built key relationships to get where they are today. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the show. I am your host, John Corcoran. I've been hosting this show since 2010 and have interviewed hundreds of entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs, ranging from Netflix to Kinko's, Grubhub, Redfin, you name it. And this is part of our agency growth series aimed at helping agencies to grow profitably. And if you're interested in this topic, digital agencies, you can go check out some of my previous episodes with guests such as Jason Swank, Carl Smith of Bureau of Digital, David C. Baker, kind of a world-renowned expert as well in agency growth, Roger Herney of Off Madison Ave. Go check it out. And of course, this episode brought to you by Rise25, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And my guest is Chip Griffin. And Chip has got a really interesting background and experience in a bunch of different areas. He's the founder and CEO of SAGA, which is a small agency growth alliance. They help PR, public affairs, and marketing agency owners to create better businesses, providing news, insights, consulting to help them to improve their processes and profit. And we're going to talk all about that. And way back in 1997, he became the CEO of townhall.com, which is a company that operated a policy-oriented web portal. So he and I overlap in terms of we both lived in DC, involved in politics, involved in the internet, podcasting. We got so many things to talk about. I'm really excited about it. He also co-founded CustomScoop, which was one of the earliest online news clipping services, which was a new thing back then. Now it's all over the place. And fun fact, he launched his first blog back in 1999. He's been podcasting since either 1999 or 2006, depending on how you categorize it. Chip, such a pleasure to have you here today. But I want to start first with, as a kid, back in fifth grade, you had a computer that was kind of handed to you. They said, this doesn't really work that well. And if you can figure out how to work it, you can use it. And that kind of lit a fire in you. So tell us the story.
Yeah, first of all, it's great to be with you, John. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. Back in fifth grade, I was sort of that difficult kid because I was smart, but I like to challenge the teachers and cause problems from that perspective. Not disciplinary problems, but just challenging them and pushing them to their limits. And so they happened to have a computer that they had gotten through a grant, and they said, we've got this TRS-80. We don't know how to use it. Maybe you can busy yourself by doing that so you spend less time nagging us. And so I said, sure, I'll take the challenge. And I taught myself how to program in BASIC. And this was, to really date myself, this was a computer that plugged into a TV via an RCA connection. So it's just really old school.
Which is really how the early computers operated. They didn't even have monitors back then.
Yeah. And in fact, there was no hard drive. There was not even a floppy drive, which my kids don't even understand.
Where was the memory then?
It was a cassette tape. So those old black cassette recorders that you had in school that teachers would play things on, that was where you saved your computer programs.
Wow. Yeah. Super early days.
Yes.
It's amazing.
So I'm old. What can I say?
And then that kind of morphed into, in high school, instead of going and working at a hot dog stand, you actually were doing computer consulting. What did that look like back in those days?
Yeah, so back then it was sort of taking on whatever projects were needed. So I would help people set up their computers. I would do some computer programming. I recall one program that I wrote for a nonprofit organization that basically did raffle tickets and sequenced them and all that kind of stuff. I did desktop publishing for various organizations, creating programs for events and that sort of thing. So it was a whole mishmash of different things back in the 80s.
It's amazing. Each of these ideas there are now probably a dozen or so different companies that have created multi-$100 million or billion-dollar companies around these individual kernels of ideas that you were playing around with back when there was nothing of the sort.
So what you're basically telling me is I'm a failure because I didn't run with any of them beyond the moment.
But it's also like, an embarrassment of riches. When you kind of see this when new technologies come along, whether it's, AI or something like that, where it's like there's so many different ideas and it's hard to know which are going to be the winners and which are going to be the pets.com, and just too early.
Right. And it's one of the reasons why I encourage people to experiment with things, learn about different things. And you want to try to find the ones that are a good fit with whatever you're doing in your current business, the things that interest you, because those are the ones you'll have the most success with.
Right. So tell us about Town Hall, because this is an interesting one. What was it? And you had a kind of a funny story where you thought they were joking when they offered you the job at 23 years old of being CEO of this company.
Yeah, so townhall.com at the time was a public policy portal, sort of an old school directory of sites with compilations of some of the information that came from them. And they had a CompuServe forum, for those of you old enough to remember those. And so I was having a conversation with the chairman of the board, who I knew very well through some prior work experience. And he was asking me for suggestions on who their next CEO should be. And so I gave him a few names, and he said, actually, we were thinking about having you do it. And I just started laughing. I thought he was joking. We were sitting there having a nice pizza lunch, and I thought he was for all the world joking with me. He said, no, I'm serious. I'm like, oh, okay. And so that's how I ended up getting that job. It was certainly unexpected, but it was a great opportunity.
It's like the old story of how Dick Cheney became vice president. He was head of the commission to decide who would be vice president, and he chose himself. Right.
Yeah.
Although it wasn't you choosing yourself, in fairness.
No, not at all.
Yeah,
not at all.
You're recommending others, and they said, oh, how about you?
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, they had come into the meeting, obviously, anticipating that they were going to ask me. And so I think they were just curious who I would suggest. Maybe it was a pre-interview question or something. I don't know.
Right. So your next step after that is Griffin Strategy Group, helping companies to create websites and online apps. I think this is very early 2000s. So very different world in terms of the software solutions, pre-WordPress. What was that like?
Yeah, so it was certainly very different. In fact, I wrote my own content management system because there wasn't a WordPress out there that existed at the time, because my clients weren't able to edit HTML themselves, and I didn't want to be doing it for them because that wasn't a cost-effective solution. So I wrote some software that allowed them to make simple updates to their websites and put content on it. And so, yeah, this was the late 90s. So I did a lot of work for media organizations, political campaigns, nonprofit organizations, that sort of thing. Basically an extension of the connections I had made when I was in Washington, D.C.
Got it. And you became, after that, Chief Digital Officer back when that was not a common title. Now, almost every big company has got a Chief Digital Officer, or lots of them do. Was that a title that you came up with yourself? How did that role come about?
Yeah, it was. So I had been doing some consulting work for a public affairs firm based in DC. And so they had talked to me about transitioning from doing some consulting for them. I'd been helping them set up a digital department structure and things like that. And they said, well, we'd like you to come and run it. And we were discussing potential titles for it. And so I threw out Chief Digital Officer, and they said, sure, that works for us. And so that's how I ended up becoming one of the first chief digital officers for any PR or public affairs firm in the world, as far as I'm aware.
And I'm wondering what it was like for you, like in that role, where there wasn't the same appreciation for the importance of a digital approach. Did you find that you were in meetings where you're the advocate for, taking a digital approach, and there are people who are, used to doing things the old school way? I mean, we're talking like late 2000s. I think probably Yellow Pages was still significant back in those days, and it wasn't even that long ago, but it's just a different approach today.
Yeah, although I will say that this particular firm had always been pretty forward thinking in the use of digital and experimenting in different ways to use it. They just really hadn't pulled it together in a cohesive department. And so, it was a very receptive environment internally within the firm. Obviously, with some clients, it was a little bit different. And so there was a lot more convincing that some clients needed, as far as not just that they should be engaged in digital communications, but how they should be doing it. And I think that was a challenge, because back then everybody just said, oh, you just do this, you just do some commenting, you just, put out some blogs and maybe play with this thing called Twitter. I don't know, must be good, right? And we'll be all set. And I tried to explain it had to be more of a strategic approach and not just throwing everything at the wall.
Yeah. Now, your next step after that, you end up developing CustomScoop, which is one of the early online news clipping services. Tell us about where that idea came from.
So actually, I developed that back in, I think it was 2000.
Okay.
So I did it at the same time that I was running my agency, Griffin Strategy Group, because I obviously with that I was selling time, but I was looking for ways to diversify my revenue streams, and had been talking with some other owners of agencies, and so we came together in partnership to create CustomScoop. As we've talked about, I had a bit of a computer programming hobbyist type habit, and so I wrote the first version of the software myself. Anyone who knows technology would be horrified at how I did that. We won't go into the details here, but it was written in a computer language that should not be used for writing an online news clipping service. But it worked, and we were able to go out and sell it, and so we did great things with it. And when I ended up going to that public affairs firm, I ended up taking a leave of absence from the firm and became chairman of the board at that point. And then subsequently, we sold CustomScoop to an international business that was consolidating those kinds of companies around the world.
Got it. And now, oftentimes when people sell a company, I've interviewed so many entrepreneurs that end up being miserable afterwards. They think it's going to be okay. They end up maybe a year or two, and then they end up leaving because it's just something they just don't mesh in the new environment. You end up joining CARMA, which is the company that acquired CustomScoop, and you end up even becoming global COO. You had 500 people or so reporting to you. Talk about what that experience was like being in that large of a company after, being in scrappy startups.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a company that very much had and still has a startup type culture, and so despite its size, very entrepreneurial, very creative in their approaches, and for me, it was a great experience because I was able to get involved in international business, which is not something that I've done or had done previously, and so it exposed me to how businesses operate in a lot of different parts of the world, and it is quite different for most people who are very U.S. centric in their business operations. It is an eye-opening experience that can help you, I think, tremendously, particularly in an increasingly global economy that we all have to thrive in. And so I found a lot of benefits to it, but as you've mentioned, there are challenges going from being an owner to an employee. So I did it for a few years, but ultimately decided that entrepreneurship really is my calling. And that's when I created SAGA to be able to help other agency owners and other entrepreneurs run their businesses and get what they want from it. And I often have that conversation that you just mentioned. You have to understand, if you're going to sell the business, here are the downsides. It's not just all about getting a nice big fat check and retiring to Tahiti. And
I want to talk about SAGA and where that fits in, and that part of your journey. Before I get to that, though, I want to ask about, so you launched your first blog in 1999, and you're doing early online interviews that you recorded and that you published even before the term podcasting was even a thing. I started a blog, actually, I guess you'd call it a blog, with my dad in 1999 when I was working at the White House as kind of like a side hustle using, I think, Netscape Navigator or something. They had some like web design kind of that was built into it, but it was super janky back in the day. How did you end up coming about, creating a blog back in 99?
Yeah. So what happened was I got married. My wife was from New England. I was from New England. We wanted to move back to New England. And so in the transition from DC to New Hampshire, as you know, all good political people, you never call yourself unemployed. You always call yourself a consultant, which is how that first agency started. I was fortunate to sign a client before I even packed up the U-Haul van. But I also realized that being in New Hampshire, I had to have a way to stay in touch with my network that I'd built over 8 years in DC. And so I created what you would today call a blog. Back then, it was just called a website called Primary Scoop. And it provided information about the New Hampshire primary, which is something that's extremely popular in DC. Everybody's wanting to know what's going on. And back in 1999, it was really difficult to get on the ground information. There just weren't as many online news sources that could feed you that. And so I filled that gap and kept my network active and was able to use it to generate new business. So it was a good way to get involved, but it was certainly not as easy to do as it is today.
So were you monetizing it? You were writing the articles, you were doing the reporting, you're publishing it, and you were monetizing it by some kind of consulting on the back end. Is that right? It wasn't like an ad-based model?
There were ads on it because there were some sort of low-cost ad network, sort of the old school equivalent of Google. Google ads weren't around then, but it was similar to that, and so that made a few bucks a month, but it was not it was by no means a real income stream. It was really just something that I used to continue to cultivate my network, and so was able to generate consulting business and agency business for me.
Okay, so this was going into the 99-2000 cycle when you did this? So this was
correct. It would have been for the 2000 New Hampshire primary.
Leading into Gore v. Bush, and Bradley was running against Gore.
Exactly.
And I can't remember who else was running against Bush, but there was a bunch of them.
There were, yep.
And so what was your best scoop during that cycle?
I
didn't think I was going to ask that, did you?
No, I mean, we're really, I mean, there were a few good ones. I mean, the big thing that I became known for was I analyzed FEC records, Federal Election Commission records, to look at the salaries of the people involved in the campaigns. And again, that was much more difficult to get back then, but I had experience in doing that kind of research. And so I published a list of all of the salaries for all of the presidential campaigns, and that got huge publicity, and various media outlets around the world picked it up. And so I guess that would probably be the biggest thing. It's not truly a scoop because it was public information, but nobody had ever compiled and done the math, because the reports don't show you a salary number. They just show what you were paid by the pay period. And so I had to sort of reverse engineer what the frequency was and all that kind of stuff. Now,
I'm gonna be a devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
So that's awesome that you're getting that attention and all that kind of stuff. Did that naturally lead into the type of consulting work that you wanted? Because I'm thinking like, okay, well then people contact you and for you to do more FEC digging, or, did you find
that was one of the services that the agency, the Griffin Strategy Group, offered. It did do corporate and opposition research.
Oh, okay. So it did work. It did make sense then. Okay.
Yeah. So it absolutely made sense, but it was also just a way to be in the inbox of my network. So, as you know, a big part of business development is awareness and making sure that people think, oh, right. Yeah. Chip. And so almost any way that you can get into their inbox on a regular basis can be helpful.
Yeah.
As long as they're paying attention to it.
Yeah. So I feel like I was an early adopter by starting to do interviews that are recorded and published online around 2009, 2010 timeframe. But you're doing it in 99, 2000. Who were you interviewing, and what was the grand plan behind it, or was there a grand plan behind it?
There was no grand plan behind it. I've always enjoyed. I mean, as a kid, I used to have a cassette recorder and a microphone, and I would do play-by-play for sports games that I was watching on TV. Nobody ever listened to them because there was no way to distribute it. But I've always enjoyed the audio medium, and so it was partly just experimenting with it. And so I went to Radio Shack and got basically what's a phone tap. Because you had to unscrew the mouthpiece on the phone and put it in there. It was a mess to do.
Record it. You recorded it through the phone line. Okay.
Yeah, you recorded it through a regular telephone, and so it was a very clunky way of doing it. But mostly, what I interviewed political operatives in New Hampshire and some journalists.
Okay.
Those were the typical guests that I had.
Okay, and explain. So, a little background on me. In 2004, I think it was January 2004, for the New Hampshire primary, I was still working in politics. It was right before I went back to law school. And on my own dime, I flew to New Hampshire because I wanted to experience what it was like. And, there's a saying that Washington, D.C. is kind of like Hollywood, but for nerds or something like that. I've heard that before. Well, the primary in New Hampshire is like that on steroids. It's kind of like Coachella for the political junkies. So talk a little bit about, you're from New Hampshire, you live in New Hampshire now, but talk a little bit about what that environment is like for people who don't know it.
It's wild because for a few weeks, every 4 years, you have everybody who is anybody in politics, whether it's an operative or a journalist or a candidate or an office holder somewhere else who might possibly want to ever run for president or might want to be Secretary of State or something. They all show up and they all come in. And because New Hampshire is a very retail state, it's a small state, it's relatively easy to get around. All of this is hand to hand. I mean, you can go into a coffee shop in Concord, New Hampshire, just before the New Hampshire primary, and you'll run into celebrities. I remember one time I was in there just having coffee one morning, and Sam Waterston came up to my table from Law and Order and said hello and wanted to lobby for whatever candidate he was supporting at the time. And I don't even recall who that was, but that's a very
really
common
effective
occurrence. Well, I mean, it's probably more speaking to my memory.
There's so many different candidates that come through, really. Yeah,
so many candidates who come through, and this was probably 2000 or 2004. So. I'm old enough that's hard to remember.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. That's really cool. Yeah, no, it's an amazing experience being there. And of course, it's January in New Hampshire, so it's freezing cold while all this is happening.
Yeah, it is not the most hospitable time to visit our state. Usually we encourage the fall, the summer, maybe even mud season. I'm sorry, spring.
Yeah. And the primary has been moving, further and further back in the calendar. That's part of it too. But it's also something that, the Granite State really takes great pride in.
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, because obviously the political parties are playing games with the calendars
every year.
And so
every year that happens.
Always does. But I suspect there may be more impact this time, but we'll see.
Yeah. And and you've continued the podcasting over the years. You continue to do it to this day. Has it evolved and changed? How has it kind of changed your, or served your purposes over the years?
Well, it's gotten so much easier, obviously. And it's become something where, as we're doing today, you have video typically along with it. So it gives you an additional format to distribute in. And so I think there's huge advantages to doing podcasts now. And so I encourage a lot of the agencies that I work with to consider podcasts, because it's a great way to demonstrate the expertise they have and to get to know new people. So, but it is, to me, it is a great medium because it's a great starting point for all other kinds of content. So if you don't love writing, do a podcast that gives you audio, it gives you video, it gives you the ability to have an article generated from it. There's just so much that can happen with it that's so much easier today than it was 25 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. That's why I've been at it for as long as I have. I just love it. It's great to meet interesting people like yourself. So SAGA, which also has a pro level to it as well. How did you started that about 2018? How did that come about? What inspired that?
So for many, many years, I've been having informal conversations with agency owners who would ask me questions because they knew that I had been successful in some of my businesses. I'd sold some, and so they would ask for advice on, whether it's pricing or profitability or perhaps selling their business someday. And so I would share those experiences free of charge. And as I was exiting CARMA, I thought about what I wanted to do next. And I said, I really enjoy what I can do in working with agencies. And so initially the business name was actually Agency Leadership Advisors, because I was working with all different kinds of agencies. But then when March of 2020 came around, it became obvious to me that there was a real challenge, particularly for small agencies who didn't have the knowledge base and infrastructure that larger or even mid-sized agencies had. And because everybody was now willing to have these conversations by Zoom that I couldn't get them to do, frankly, prior to March of 2020 with any regularity, I was able to start economically serving those kinds of businesses around the world. And so I transitioned to SAGA at that point, where I could be a resource for small agencies, not just here in the US, where I could hop on a plane or get in a car and go see them, but ones around the world. And so now I work with agencies in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and of course the United States. And it's a great experience for me, building off of that international experience that I had previously. But it's also a great experience because I can help people who didn't really have access to that in a meaningful way before.
And what are some of the agencies you're working with now? What are their challenges today as we, record this in May of 2023? What are some of the challenges they're grappling with?
Yeah. So, I think, top of the list is that most agency owners don't have a clear vision for what they want from the business. Most agencies have started because someone was a freelancer. They ended up taking on more work than they could handle. So they brought in some contractors and eventually hired employees. And so everything's going forward by inertia. And so the first thing I always do with an agency owner is sit down with them and say, okay, what are you actually trying to get from this? Because if you're going to take on all of the risk, all of the stress that comes with being a business owner, you need to be getting what you want from it and not what someone else tells you should want from it. And so working with them to help them do that, I think, sets the agency off in the right direction. I think that's the starting point for just about any agency owner.
Yeah. And agencies today are able, maybe not all of them are doing this, but they're able to serve, just like you, clients all over the globe. So that's certainly changed things for agencies.
Absolutely. And so you need to understand, who do you want to serve? How much money do you want to make? How many hours do you want to work? What flexibility are you looking for? A lot of agency owners, particularly if they're newer, they may need that flexibility for family things and all of that. And so you need to be designing your business around that and not feeling like, geez, well, this is what I'm supposed to do next, because no two agencies are exactly the same. You should be building something that serves your needs. Otherwise, go get a job somewhere else where someone else can boss you around.
And it's really interesting. There's, agency is such a broad term, and there's so many different flavors of agencies out there, because I see some out there that they're all in Minneapolis. All their employees are in Minneapolis. They all come into the office, or it's there are other ones that are kind of a hybrid format, or there's like us where we have a team, we have both domestic and international staff that are all over the globe, completely remote, and we want it to be that way. So it's really interesting how many different structures you can have as an agency today.
Yeah, and I think that the key is to understand what you want and then create a public identity for that agency that you can share with other people. Because I think that's the next place that agencies tend to fall down, is they can't clearly articulate what it is that they do and who they serve. And if you don't have that clear identity and positioning, it becomes really difficult to grow in a meaningful way, because then you're just taking along whatever business happens to wander across your doorstep.
So you've mentioned a couple of the mistakes that agencies make today. What other sorts of mistakes do you see agencies making that are tripping them up or that are holding them back?
Yeah, after those first two, I think that the next biggest one would be the inability to price correctly. And this comes in a whole bunch of different flavors, but a lot of it comes down to agencies don't understand how they're actually spending their time working for clients. And so that may be because of scope creep, which we often talk about in the agency world, but it may be that they just didn't do a good job of estimating in advance. A lot of this comes down to painful things or less comfortable things like time tracking. And you really do need to do that in order to understand how profitable your different projects are, because you want to get more ideal clients who are actually paying you what you deserve and are helping you to earn the profits that you deserve. And so you need to really focus in on those kinds of things, because that will allow you to price both competitively and profitably, which is what leads to growth.
So what are some of the growth opportunities that you're seeing in the agency world these days? Obviously, May of 2023, everyone's talking about, AI. That's a popular topic. The economy has been a little weird over the last 6 months, so that's affecting businesses in different ways. But what are some growth opportunities that you're seeing people pursuing?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of agencies are interested in AI. Some are enthusiastic about it and looking at how they can use it. Others are fearful of it and think that it may impact negatively their own businesses. I think that AI is certainly an area that you need to be looking at how you can integrate it with your agency. I don't think it's something to be feared. I think it's just another tool in the arsenal, a great tool, but a tool nonetheless. And you need to figure out how you can take advantage of that to better serve your clients. The economy is something that certainly comes up in many, or if not most, of the conversations I'm having with agency owners. They want to know, are we going to have a recession? How's it going to impact me? And I think the important thing for agency owners to understand, whether it's May of 2023 or some other time, is that no recession, no macroeconomic condition impacts every agency the same. And every time we've had these kinds of slowdowns in the past, and I'm old enough to have been through quite a few of them over the last 30 years, it impacts businesses based on who they are serving and how those industries are being affected in that time. And so you need to really be putting your ear to the ground, listening to your clients, as you should at all times, but particularly now, to understand not just what's really happening to them, but how they're behaving. So one of the things that I'm seeing is there are clients out there who are pulling back, even though they're not seeing any impact of economics on their organization today. They're not seeing a recession, but they're just saying, well, maybe I need to hold on to some cash. Maybe I just need to be a little more careful. And so those are the kinds of things you need to be aware of as an agency, because that's going to have more of an impact on you than the actual news media reports on, are we in recession or not?
Well, Chip, this has been great. SAGA sounds amazing. I know I'm going to be checking it out afterwards. I'm really glad to learn about it from you. Where can people go to learn more about you and about SAGA and connect with you?
Simple. Best place to go is smallagencygrowth.com, and you can find all of the resources, podcasts, more information about me, all that right there.
And the name of your podcast so people can go check it out?
So I have several. The main one is Agency Leadership Podcast that I co-host with Ginny Dietrich of Spin Sucks. And so that's probably the flagship one, but you can go find the others on the website as well.
Excellent, Chip. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.